Ladies and gentlemen, let me tell you something that might shake you for a moment. The reason he comes back after disappearing isn't because you were easy to walk away from, it's because you became impossible to replace. When your silence grows louder than your words ever did, when your absence hits harder than your presence ever could, something shifts in him. Suddenly he realizes the world out there doesn't offer what you brought effortlessly. And tonight, I'm going to show you why that moment, his return, is not a victory for him, but a revelation of your power. Ladies, if you've ever sat in the quiet of your room, staring at your phone, wondering why a man who disappeared suddenly reappears as if nothing happened, you're not alone. There is a mystery to human behavior, but there is no mystery to your worth. And when you understand that, you begin to see his return not as a compliment to you, but as a revelation about him. Men return after no contact for reasons that have far less to do with your value and far more to do with their clarity that often arrives late. When the noise of daily life settles, when distractions fade, and when the rush of novelty dies down, he is left alone with his thoughts. And in that silence, he remembers. He remembers the version of himself he was when he was with you. He remembers the peace, the laughter, the grounding presence you brought. He remembers the way you made him feel something he didn't know he needed until it was gone. But here is the truth you need to hold. A man's return is not an automatic sign of growth. Sometimes it's simply a sign of discomfort. People often come back to what feels familiar when the new world they ventured into didn't fill the void they thought it would. That doesn't mean you should accept it. It doesn't mean you should open your door at the first knock. It simply means you've become a mirror he can't stop looking for. You reflected a better version of him, and now he's wondering where that light went. What you must understand is that pull he feels has a lot to do with your absence. Your silence is powerful. Your distance creates an environment where he can finally see. When you step back, you give him what he didn't give you, space to feel the consequences of his choices. And trust me, consequences speak louder than affection ever could. A person can ignore your words, but they cannot ignore the shift in energy when your presence is no longer available to them. When you stop chasing, when you stop trying to prove your worth, something incredible happens. You reclaim your power. You stop waiting for a man to choose you, and you begin to choose yourself. And that self-respect, it becomes magnetic. Not because you're pretending to be aloof, not because you're playing a game, but because genuine self-worth radiates in a way that people can feel even from a distance. Men return because they sense the shift. They sense that you're no longer orbiting around them. They feel the difference between being wanted and being optional. And when a man realizes that the woman who once prioritized him has learned to prioritize herself, it disrupts something in him. It challenges his ego. It awakens his curiosity. It forces him to question the story he told himself about you. But when he returns, he isn't coming back to the same woman he left. At least not if you've used the silence wisely. Not if you've taken that time to grow, to heal, to build a life independent of his validation. When a man comes back to a woman who is transformed in his absence, he encounters someone who now holds the pen to her own story. Someone who understands that love cannot be sustained by effort alone. Someone who refuses to accept crumbs where she deserves consistency. And if he is not ready, truly ready, to meet you at that level, his return will feel different this time. Before, it might have been exciting, confusing, emotionally charged. Now, it will feel like clarity. Because when you grow, your standards grow with you. The bare minimum that once made you hopeful now feels insulting. The mixed signals that once kept you overthinking now feel like noise you no longer have the patience for. And the emotional laziness you once excused now looks like a deal breaker. Men return after no contact because the silence compels them to reflect. But your strength compels them to choose. And it is your responsibility, not his, to decide whether his choice aligns with your future. You see, when you step into your highest self, you stop waiting for evidence that someone cares. You start observing patterns instead of promises. You start valuing effort over excuses. You start believing that anyone who wants a place in your life must earn it, not through grand gestures or emotional apologies, but through consistency, integrity, and action. And let's be honest. Sometimes a man returns, not because he has changed, but because he assumed you wouldn't. He thought you'd stay stuck in the same cycle, waiting with the same open heart, willing to forgive without boundaries. But when he finds that you've evolved, that your heart is open but guarded by wisdom, it forces him to show up differently or walk away. And both outcomes are victories for you. This is why you never chase, not because you're trying to be difficult, but because you're building a life so full that no one becomes your only source of happiness. You're creating a reality where love is a complement to your life, not the foundation of it. You're learning that emotional strength is not about shutting people out, but about letting the right people in. You become the woman who knows her value, not because someone told her, but because she lived it, she enforced it, she protected it. And when a man meets that version of you, he knows he cannot return with the same energy he left with, because this time you won't bend your boundaries for his convenience. You won't shrink yourself to make him comfortable. You won't settle for potential when you deserve presence. Men return after no contact because at some point they realize they underestimated the woman you are. They realize they mistaken your kindness for complacency, your patience for passivity, your vulnerability for weakness. But the version of you standing here today is no longer willing to be misunderstood. You are no longer interested in love that is uncertain. You are no longer impressed by bare minimum effort. You are no longer available for emotional chaos dressed as passion. You want peace, you want truth, you want partnership, not performance. And when he returns, you get to choose, you get to listen not to his words, but to his willingness to grow. You get to ask yourself, not does he want me back, but does this align with the life I am building? You get to honor your intuition rather than your loneliness. And you get to realize that sometimes the most powerful response to someone returning is not excitement or anger or confusion. It is calm. The calm that comes from knowing that your life is full either way. Because in the end, the reason men return is simple. Your absence amplified your value. But the reason you don't lose yourself in that moment is even simpler. Your growth amplified your standards. And now the decision is yours. And when you hold that power, when you recognize that someone's return does not define your worth but merely highlights theirs, something remarkable happens inside you. You stop needing closure from the person who left, and instead you create closure through who you've become. Because the moment you realize that you no longer hinge your happiness on someone else's choices, you step into a version of yourself that is grounded, self-assured, and beautifully unshakable. When a man reappears after no contact, he is often encountering a woman he didn't expect to find. He may have walked away thinking you would wait, thinking you would stay in the same emotional place, thinking you would still be there, holding the same space for him. And then, when he comes back, he finds that you've filled that space with your growth, your purpose, your peace. He finds that your time has become more valuable, your energy more guarded, your standards more defined. And that is when he realizes that returning is not enough. He must rise. See, absence doesn't just clarify feelings, it exposes priorities. When someone is truly aligned with you, their absence becomes uncomfortable, not liberating. They don't feel relief in the distance. They feel the weight of what they're risking. They don't feel excitement exploring other options. They feel the ache of what they walked away from. And when they return, they often carry the humility of someone who has learned that not everything they walked away from will still be waiting for them. But that humility only matters if it is paired with effort. A man returning without change is simply a man visiting his comfort zone. A man returning with intention, however, is someone who has faced the friction of his own patterns and realized they no longer serve him. And you get to observe which one he is. Not with attachment, not with fear, but with clarity. Because no contact is not just a strategy, it is a transformation. It shifts both people. It forces you to confront your own emotions, your own patterns, your own attachments. It teaches you what you were settling for, what you were giving too freely, what you were tolerating in hopes of potential. And on the other side of that silence, you emerge with a kind of strength that doesn't need validation. A kind of confidence that doesn't beg for reassurance, a kind of peace that doesn't cling to chaos. This is the version of you he feels from a distance. That energy carries. It reaches him in moments when he least expects it, when he's scrolling through his phone late at night, when he's reminded of a conversation you once had, when he meets someone who doesn't ignite him the way you did. It reaches him in the spaces where his distractions can't quiet his truth. And that truth, however delayed, nudges him back toward you. But here's the part most people overlook. Men don't just return because they miss you. They return because they miss the version of themselves they were with you. They miss feeling understood. They miss feeling admired. They miss the emotional safety you created. They miss the way you made room for them to be vulnerable without demanding that they always have everything figured out. They miss the way your presence softened their edges and helped them access a deeper part of themselves. The question isn't whether he returns. The question is who he is when he does. Does he return because you became hard to replace, or because he finally became ready to be the man he wasn't before? Does he return seeking comfort or seeking commitment? Does he return because he's lonely or because he's awakened? Does he return with curiosity or with responsibility? You don't owe him entry just because he reappears. You don't owe him forgiveness just because he feels regret. You don't owe him a second chance simply because he realized what he lost. What you owe is loyalty to yourself, to your growth, to your peace, to your future. When you evaluate his return from that lens, you stop asking, does he still want me? And you start asking, does he align with the woman I've become? Because the woman you've become is not the woman who needs to be chosen. She is the woman who chooses. This shift is what makes you powerful. This shift is what makes you magnetic. This shift is what separates you from the version of yourself who would have taken someone back out of fear rather than intention. And it's this shift that a man feels when he tries to step back into your life. He feels the difference in your tone, your boundaries, your energy. He senses that you no longer seek his approval. He feels that you're no longer trying to convince him of your worth. Instead, he feels that you know it. And that knowledge changes everything. Because when you know your worth, you stop negotiating it. You stop shrinking for people who need you small. You stop tolerating uncertainty from people who want your devotion while offering only fragments of their own. You stop waiting for someone to wake up and see what has been obvious all along. You start living. You start choosing peace over chaos. You start prioritizing consistency over chemistry. You start valuing actions over intentions. You start observing behavior instead of explaining it away. You start trusting yourself more than you trust someone's potential. And that is why he returns, to see if the door he once walked through is still open, or if the woman on the other side has learned that she deserves far more than being someone's almost, someone's maybe, someone's emotional placeholder. But when you've done the work, you no longer fear his return. You no longer fear his absence. You no longer fear letting go. You understand that your life is not measured by who stays or who leaves, but by how deeply you honor your heart in the process. You become unafraid of endings because you have built a life filled with new beginnings. You become unafraid of loneliness because you've discovered the beauty of your own company. You become unafraid of rejection because you know it protects you from the wrong people. You become unafraid of silence because you've learned that what grows in silence is strength. So when he comes back, you meet him with that strength, not to punish him, not to play hard to get, not to manipulate the situation, but to protect the life you've built in his absence, to guard the peace you fought for, to honor the boundaries that helped you transform. You give him the chance to show you that he's ready, but you no longer give him the ability to derail your growth. You listen, but you no longer abandon your standards. You engage, but you no longer abandon yourself. And if he has truly grown, he will show up not with excuses, but with accountability, not with vague promises, but with clear effort, not with fear of losing you, but with courage to keep you, not with emotional dependence, but with emotional maturity. Because a man returning is not the goal. A man returning transformed is. And if he hasn't transformed, you don't cling to the illusion of what could be, you honor the reality of what is. You let him go without resentment, knowing that your life is moving in a direction he may not be ready for. You release the past without bitterness, knowing that your future holds connections built on alignment, not attachment. And as you walk forward, you carry the understanding that anyone who leaves your life creates space for something greater, whether that something is a better version of them or a better match for you. You carry the wisdom that your worth is constant, independent of someone's recognition of it. You carry the truth that love is not a reward for waiting, but a partnership built through mutual effort, growth, and intention. Most importantly, you carry a deeper belief in yourself, a belief forged in the quiet moments when you chose healing over reaching out, growth over clinging, and self-love over desperation. And that belief becomes the foundation on which your future relationships are built. Because once you learn to love yourself in the silence someone left you with, you will never again settle for a love that cannot stand in the noise of real life. And once you reach that stage, where your sense of self is no longer tied to who stays or who leaves, something even more powerful happens. You begin to see relationships not as lifelines, but as choices. You stop seeing someone's return as a rescue, and instead you see it as a moment of reflection, a moment that gives you information about who they are and who you've become. And it's from that clarity that you make decisions that honor your emotional evolution instead of your emotional wounds. When he comes back after no contact, he's stepping into a world he didn't expect you to build. He left a version of you who might have been hopeful, patient, maybe even anxious for certainty. But he returned to a woman who has reclaimed her center, a woman who no longer crumbles at mixed signals or grasps for validation, a woman who can stand firmly in the truth that love should elevate, not drain. He returns to find that the dynamic has shifted, that you are no longer bending to his rhythm, you are living by your own. This shift is not arrogance, and it's not emotional detachment. It's maturity, it's growth, it's knowing that the love you offer is valuable enough that someone has to be ready to meet it. When you reach that point, you understand that anyone who returns is not doing you a favor, they are being given an opportunity. And opportunities have requirements. He must prove consistency where before he showed confusion. He must demonstrate growth where before he showed avoidance. He must offer clarity where before he offered chaos. Because the woman you are now doesn't respond to old patterns. She doesn't fall for temporary intensity. She doesn't confuse effort for commitment. She listens with the same depth she always had, but she chooses with a wisdom she didn't have before. And that wisdom changes everything. You start noticing things you once overlooked. You see hesitation where before you saw hope. You see excuses where before you saw emotions. You see inconsistency where before you saw potential. But you also see sincerity where before you might have doubted it. You see effort in places you once ignored. You see someone trying in ways they didn't know how to before. And because you're grounded, you can tell the difference between effort that comes from fear of losing you and effort that comes from genuine desire to grow. This is what makes you powerful, not rejecting someone's return, but being able to discern whether that return contributes to your life or disrupts it. When someone comes back, they often expect to step into the story they left. But they forgot the story continued without them. You kept turning pages, you kept learning, healing, expanding, you kept discovering new parts of yourself, parts that are now non-negotiable. Your peace is no longer an afterthought. Your boundaries are no longer flexible. Your happiness is no longer dependent on how someone treats you one day and ignores you the next. He's returning to a woman who doesn't just hope for love. She knows what it's supposed to feel like, and that realization shifts the entire dynamic. Suddenly, you're not afraid to ask the questions you once tiptoed around. You're not afraid to know the truth of his intentions. You're not afraid to hear answers that may change the future. Because strength replaces fear when you finally understand that clarity protects you far more than uncertainty ever could. And when you operate from that place, you naturally attract a different level of connection, sometimes from the same person who left you, and sometimes from someone entirely new. Either way, you're no longer living in a way that begs for love. You're living in a way that welcomes it. This is why men come back, not because you waited, but because you didn't. Not because you held on, but because you let go. Not because you clung to the story, but because you allowed it to unfold without forcing an ending. Men return when they feel the shift, when they realize they can't access the version of you they once took for granted. They return when they sense you've risen to a level where you are no longer emotionally dependent on their choice. They return because your independence challenges them to rise too. But here's what many people don't understand. You don't rise to punish someone. You rise because your healing demanded it. You rise because your life deserved it. And when someone returns, you don't use your growth as a weapon. You use it as a filter. You use it to decide whether this person aligns with the future you're building or belongs in a chapter you've outgrown. And the more you grow, the more you realize something profound. Love is not proven by someone coming back. Love is proven by what they do once they return. Do they step up? Do they take responsibility? Do they bring consistency? Or do they bring nostalgia? Do they offer emotional depth? Or do they rely on who you used to be to validate them again? Do they build with you? Or do they try to drag you backward into old dynamics? Your growth teaches you to look beyond the gesture of returning and instead pay attention to the quality of presence they bring. Because anyone can reappear. Not everyone can rebuild, and when you finally understand this, you no longer fear losing someone who is not ready. You realize that you're not losing someone, you're gaining space. Space for someone who will show up the first time. Space for someone who won't need the absence to understand your value. Space for someone who won't treat you like a temporary emotional destination, but a long-term partner in growth, life, and love. This is the beauty of silence. It reveals truth. It reveals alignment. It reveals effort. It reveals who comes back out of loneliness and who comes back out of clarity. And you learn to tell the difference by watching how they behave when the novelty of return fades and the responsibility of consistency begins. And as you step forward into this new chapter of yourself, you begin to experience relationships differently. You no longer chase answers, you invite them. You no longer fear being alone. You choose where your heart feels at peace. You no longer give love out of lack, you give love out of abundance. And that abundance transforms the way you connect, the way you receive, the way you show up. You become a woman who is not moved by empty promises, but by proven actions. You become a woman who is not swayed by uncertainty, but anchored in self-respect. You become a woman who is not impressed by someone returning, but inspired by someone growing. You become a woman who can appreciate someone's desire to come back without losing sight of what you deserve going forward. And that is where your true power lives, in the ability to welcome someone with grace while still honoring the boundaries shaped by your evolution. In the ability to hold compassion without sacrificing yourself. In the ability to love deeply without abandoning the wisdom your journey taught you. Because ultimately, a man returning is not the story. The story is the woman he returns to, the one who has risen, the one who has grown, the one who has healed, the one who no longer fears endings because she now trusts beginnings, the one who understands that love is not measured by who comes back, but by who stays and shows up with the same consistency she gives. And the most beautiful part? You now know that whoever stands beside you, whether it's him renewed or someone new entirely, you will meet them as the strongest, wisest, most grounded version of yourself you have ever been.